This is the last video in this month's theme of April Foolery and Fakery. Today I'm going to show you how to do fake in the round swatching. Now you may be familiar with this technique already, but after the demonstration I'll be talking about how you can bend and even break the rules of swatching that you've been told for years. We've all been told that before you begin a project, you should knit a swatch sufficiently large that allows you to measure across 4 inches of the fabric without including the edge stitches. And I don't believe that this is always true. Sometimes I don't even swatch at all. So I'm going to tell you after the demonstration when I bend and break the rules of swatching and why, and also what those rules are based on that nobody ever really talks about. So let's get started.
Okay, so I always start my swatches with a few rows of garter stitch, just to, regardless of whether I'm knitting the flat or doing a fake in the round swatch. And that just allows me to, later when I wash and block it, I can just pin the garter stitch bits down to my block, and I don't have to worry about trying to control the edge, which might be rolling up otherwise. So I've started, and you work it back and forth like I would normally. Okay, so I've just finished a row of garter stitch, and rather than turning and working back the other direction, I am going to work across this row again with this side still facing me. And the way that I do that is I loosely strand the yarn across the work, and then I'm going to kind of anchor it with my finger. Now I tension the yarn, the working yarn, in my left hand like this. So I've done that, and now I'm going to put some tension against the needle here so that I don't accidentally take all of the slack out of that stranded yarn. And now I can begin working across by knitting. And here I'm just going to finish up, and this stitch is going to be very loose and sloppy. Don't worry about these edges, and I just tug down on a little bit to tighten it up. Don't worry about that. That's why we don't measure the edge stitches, because they're going to be sloppy and distorted. So I've completed this row. Now I'm going to show you how to do this if you hold the yarn in your right hand. So you do the same thing with stranding the yarn very loosely across. You want to stretch these stitches out so that you can make sure that you are stranding the yarn loosely enough. You can let it droop even. It's completely fine. So I'm going to put a little pressure here just so I can make sure that I'm keeping that loose. And now I can tension the yarn in my right hand as I would. And there, we can get started there. So then you can knit across that way. So the key is to keep these strands very loose. So here's an example of a swatch that was done by doing stranded color work. And this has not been washed or blocked yet. This is just the rough swatch. And you can see what I've done here at the end where I know these stitches are going to be bad. I worked the two colors together so that they're both anchored at this end. And then I stranded them across, and then I would work the first two stitches together for a couple of stitches. And then I could work my repeats across. Now, this has not been washed and blocked yet, and I would get a much better idea of what the finished result would be if I did that. Now, this has twice as many strands going across as it would with a single color, and you may find that, well, you stranded loosely, but maybe not loose enough, and your edges are curling around, so it's still not able to lie flat. What you can do is you can actually cut these strands right here, then you can wash and block, and then you'd be able to let your swatch lie flat. Now, of course, you can't reuse that yarn. It's always a good idea to buy an extra ball or two of yarn anyway for swatching, or just to ensure that you're not going to run short. So that's, especially for stranded color work, I do tend to cut these strands just so that I can give them a good wash and block and make sure that when I'm measuring across them, I'm not measuring with a bunch of yarn kind of poofing everything up.
So what are the reasons for swatching? Well, one reason is to make sure that you've got the correct needle to get the correct gauge, but that's not the only reason to swatch. I often swatch just so that I can understand how the stitch pattern works. Where am I likely to make mistakes so that when I'm working in the bigger project, I'll know what to look out for. But the other thing that I can learn about that stitch pattern is that I hate it, and there's no way that I'm going to be able to get through an entire project working that stitch pattern. And I'd rather know that now on a small piece of fabric than to find out much later when I'm working on a substantially larger project. Another reason to swatch is simply to see if the yarn that you've chosen is compatible with the stitch pattern. Sometimes one of them just has to go. You may love both of them, but just not together. Okay, so those are reasons to swatch, but why do you have to swatch in the round or do a fake in the round swatch? Why can't you just swatch flat? Well, sometimes I do, but it's in very specific situations. I know that when I knit in the round, my gauge is exactly the same as it is when I knit flat, but many knitters aren't that way. So since the project will be knit in the round, you really need to simulate swatching in the round to make sure that you are getting the right needle for your gauge. There are other reasons to swatch in the round. I like to learn the stitch pattern in the way that I'm going to be knitting the stitch pattern. If you're trying to knit the swatch flat, that means every other row you have to reverse the instructions and reverse the actual stitches. Knits become pearls, pearls become knits, and you're having to knit the sequence in the opposite direction. It can also be very difficult sometimes to read the knitting from the wrong side of the work, depending on what sort of stitch pattern it is. Stranded color work is much harder to read on the wrong side of the work, and stitch patterns where there is really action going on every row with cable crossings or decreases or increases, those can be much more difficult to try to do on the wrong side of the work. So it's best to just go ahead and fake an in-the-round swatch. So sometimes I skip swatching altogether, and that's because I am very familiar with what stockinette gauge I am going to get with a specific needle. So the only time I might swatch in order to determine my stockinette gauge, for me, is when I'm going to be knitting the yarn at a much firmer gauge than is called for. I don't always know what needle is going to allow me to squish those stitches together in the amount of space that I need. But for standard gauges and for loose gauges, I know which needle is going to give me which gauge, and so I don't bother. Another reason I skip swatching is if the project just has a very small number of stitches, say less than 50 stitches, then I wouldn't bother swatching. I'll just cast on for the project and then see what happens. I'll make my best guess about what needle size I'm going to need, and then I work the project and measure as I go along and see if it is conforming to the dimensions that the finished project is supposed to have. So finally, the burning question, does the swatch actually have to be big enough for you to measure across 4 inches? And I think the answer to that is no. And the reason I say it's no is because that advice is based on a lot of averages. It's based on the average knitter and the average project that you're going to be knitting and what stitch pattern that project is going to be knit in and how big it's going to be. So those assumptions are based on using a medium weight yarn like DK Aran or worsted weight, that middle range yarn weight. And the assumption is that you'll be knitting a sweater in stockinette. The information given to you on the ball band of a ball of yarn is based on a stockinette sweater. So that gauge will give you a nice fabric if you're knitting a stockinette sweater. But we're not always knitting stockinette sweaters. We're often knitting stockinette socks, which have to be firmer, or we're knitting a lace shawl, which has to be looser. So that information is all based on these averages. So If you are using a medium weight yarn and you wanted to make a sweater for an adult, a 4-inch swatch, which has about 20 stitches across 4 inches, would probably be exactly the amount that you need in order to give you enough information to make sure that your sweater was going to be the right size when you completed it. But we're not always knitting things that are 40 inches around. Sometimes we're knitting things that are 8 inches around, or sometimes we're using really tiny thin yarn, or sometimes we're using the huge, massive, bulky, super bulky yarn, and the situation is very different. So for me, I find that 20 stitch to 24 stitches that you would have to measure for worsted weight is about the right number of stitches for any yarn weight. Now the resulting fabric is going to vary widely in how big or small it is because the stitches are bigger or smaller. You can find your gauge by measuring the actual number of stitches that you have and dividing it by the actual width that it truly is. Well, I hope this cleared up a little bit of the mystery behind swatching. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down in the comments below, or you can join my discussion group on Ravelry, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.